I never liked the nickname. For years, it sat on top of the file because that was how Los Angeles remembered her. The words were useful to newspapers, useful to book covers, useful to every later retelling that wanted a title before it wanted a person. The Black Dahlia. It was too clean, too stylish, too easy to repeat. The girl beneath it was Elizabeth Short, 22 years old, and the longer I lived with the case, the more that simple fact mattered. Not because it solved anything. It did not. It mattered because the nickname kept pulling the story away from the one place it should have started. Elizabeth Short did not begin as a symbol. She began as a young woman in a city that was very good at selling possibility and very poor at protecting people who arrived with little more than hope. Los Angeles in 1947 could look generous from a distance. Sunlight, palm trees, studio gates, hotel lobbies, bus stations, apartment courtyards, men home from war, women trying to build lives after the country had shifted under them again. The city promised reinvention, but it did not promise stability. A person could be noticed for a moment, then become anonymous by the next morning. Hollywood was close enough to be seen, and far enough to remain impossible. Elizabeth moved through that city before strangers began turning her life into a warning. She had been in California before. She had moved between rooms, acquaintances, plans, and disappointments. Some people remembered her clearly. Others remembered her only after the case had become famous, which is not the same thing. In a city full of temporary arrangements, she was not unusual because she was unsettled. She only became unusual because of what happened to her. The file most people know begins on the morning of January 15, 1947. Betty Bersinger was walking with her small daughter near South Norton Avenue when she saw something pale in a vacant lot. The mind reaches for ordinary explanations first. A mannequin, a discarded object, something left there by someone careless. Then the morning changed. The details of the discovery do not need to be dressed up. What mattered to investigators was not spectacle, but implication. The condition and placement of Elizabeth's body told police that the lot was probably not where the violence began. That meant movement, time, transportation, risk. Someone had controlled more than one place in the story, and one of those places was still unknown. That was the first real gap. Where had she been before South Norton Avenue? The first officers were not entering a legend. They were trying to preserve a public scene before the city stepped on it. A vacant lot has no door to close. It has neighbors, passing cars, reporters approaching too quickly, people leaning from windows, and edges that blur before anyone knows which mark might matter. Police had to hold back curiosity while also asking the first practical questions. Who called, who passed, who saw a vehicle, who heard nothing, who remembered the street as it had been before the morning became famous. Memory is difficult even when people are honest. One neighbor may remember nothing because there was nothing to remember. Another may recall something later because the newspapers have taught the whole city what ought to have been noticed. The first hours of a public case are always fragile. In this one, they were already beginning to break. The early reports did not give detectives the comfort of a contained crime scene. That mattered more than the public usually understands. A contained scene, however terrible, gives investigators walls. It gives them doors, entry points, neighbors who heard a sound through plaster, and a smaller world to test. A public lot gives them exposure. It gives them weather, movement, people who passed without knowing they were passing through history, and reporters arriving before the facts have had time to settle. From the beginning, the scene suggested a crime that had started elsewhere. That made the case larger than the lot. Detectives had to imagine a hidden place before they could prove one. A room, a vehicle, a private space. some location where the first violence occurred and from which Elizabeth was later moved. The city suddenly became part of the crime scene, not all of it equally, but enough of it to make the investigation widen before it had a center. That widening is one of the reasons the file still feels unstable. The public remembers South Norton Avenue because that is where the discovery happened. Investigators had to look beyond it because discovery is not always origin. The difference between those two words can decide an entire case. The city did not yet know the nickname. The suspects had not yet gathered. The false confessors had not yet started using police time. At that point, there was a young woman without a confirmed name, a scene that could not be fully sealed, and officers trying to keep facts from becoming rumor. The first job was identification. Without a name, the investigation has no past to walk into. With a name, detectives can begin to move backward, where she stayed, who saw her, which rooms held her recently, who helped her, who exaggerated knowing her, and who had reason to keep quiet. The Los Angeles Police Department led the investigation, and the FBI was asked to help. One detail from the federal side still carries a strange force. Elizabeth Short's fingerprints were sent through the old sound photo system, a photo transmission method that could move images far faster than ordinary mail. The FBI compared the prints and returned her identity in less than an hour. The system gave her name back in 56 minutes. It never gave back the name of her killer. That contrast sits at the center of the case. Records could answer a precise question when the material was good and the person was already in the system. But after Elizabeth was identified, the next questions were messier. Where had she been during the missing stretch? Which witness could be trusted? Which story had already been shaped by gossip? Which man mattered because he was close to the timeline? And which man only became interesting because the press needed a face? Once her name was known, two investigations began to move at once. The official investigation tried to build a route. The public investigation tried to build a story. The speed of print created another problem. Once a phrase entered a newspaper, it could return to the police station disguised as memory. A caller might say he had seen Elizabeth in a lobby, but had he seen her, or had he seen the photograph and placed it inside a memory of a similar woman? A man might claim to know where she had been, but was he offering knowledge or repeating a rumor that had traveled through 3 bars before reaching a reporter? In a quieter case, investigators can sometimes protect the difference between public fact and private fact. In this case, that line weakened quickly. Details moved from police to press, from press to breakfast tables to phone calls, and back into the police file. Each time the information traveled, it could pick up confidence without gaining accuracy. That is how noise becomes official-looking, not all at once, not through one mistake, through repetition. A detective dealing with that kind of public file has to keep 2 questions alive at the same time. What is this person telling me? And how could this person have learned it? The second question can be more important than the first. Newspapers wanted Elizabeth's life made readable by the next edition, but a life does not become clear because an editor needs copy. Reporters wanted photographs, acquaintances, hotel clerks, men who had known her, women who had spoken to her, and anything that could make the dead girl feel like a character the public already understood. Some of that work helped. Publicity can bring witnesses forward. It can spread a name quickly. It can pressure officials to keep moving. But publicity also changes the air around a case. Once a detail is printed, a false confessor can repeat it. Once a photograph is public, a witness may begin remembering the photograph instead of the person. Once a nickname takes hold, the victim's actual name has to compete with it forever. That is what happened to Elizabeth Short. Her face became public property. Her hopes were turned into evidence of character. Her instability, no different from the instability of many young people living on little money in a large city, was made to look darker because the ending was dark. A hotel became suspicious. A cafe became meaningful. A photograph became a theory. Rumor moved faster than caution. The nickname finished what the headlines had started. There are disputes about how Black Dahlia attached itself to her, but once it entered the public record, it traveled with the efficiency of a phrase built for print. It sounded like a film title. It had color and shadow in it. It made the case easier to remember and harder to see. A nickname is not evidence, but it can behave like evidence in the public mind. It tells people where to look and what mood to bring with them. Detectives did not have the luxury of mood. They had to build the last known movements. In any murder investigation, the final stretch of a life becomes the narrowest bridge. Who saw her last? Where did she go? Was she alone? Was she waiting? Did she trust the person she left with? Did the fatal encounter begin as something ordinary? One early figure police had to examine was Robert "Red" Manley, the salesman connected to Elizabeth's final known movements after she had been in San Diego and before she vanished from certainty in Los Angeles. His name mattered because the timeline made it matter. That did not make him the killer. It made him unavoidable. This is where investigations differ from public suspicion. Detectives must look hardest at people near the last reliable edge of the victim's life. But proximity is not guilt. A person can be questioned, doubted, tested, and released. Manley helped define the known side of the bridge. Beyond him, the file entered darker ground. The Biltmore Hotel became part of that ground. So did bus stations, lobbies, streets, and all the places where a person could be seen without being truly followed. A hotel lobby offers witnesses but not certainty. A clerk may remember a face. A passerby may remember a woman who looked like the one in the newspaper. Someone may have seen Elizabeth waiting. Someone else may have seen only an image that later publicity taught them to recognize. That is why the Biltmore matters in the case. It is not only a location. It is a reminder that the final gap was public, not hidden in a locked room. The possible witnesses were ordinary people with ordinary limitations. Eyes are not cameras. Memory is not a transcript. By the time the city knew her face, the value of some memories had already become difficult to measure. The police had to separate witnesses from echoes. The final gap is where the case tightens. Before that gap, investigators had people and places they could name. They could follow Manley's account. They could examine the San Diego connection. They could trace Elizabeth toward downtown Los Angeles. They could ask about the Biltmore, about waiting, about leaving, about whom she may have expected to meet. The work was difficult, but at least it had handles. After the gap, the file becomes more like a room with too many doors. One door leads toward someone she knew. Another toward someone who only crossed her path at the end. Another toward a person with access to a private space. Another toward a vehicle. Another toward the letters. Another toward the later medical theories. The trouble is that each door opens onto partial evidence. None opens cleanly onto a conviction. That is why the last known movements mattered so much. They were not background. They were the narrow place where the known Elizabeth Short approached the unknown killer. If the bridge had held, the case might have had a different life. But it did not hold strongly enough, and the rest of the investigation had to work around the break. That task became harder once the confessions began. Famous cases attract people who want to stand near the flame. Some walked in, some wrote, some called. Some sounded unstable, theatrical, drunk, angry, desperate, or hungry to be punished for reasons that had nothing to do with Elizabeth Short. Each claim had to be tested against a basic question. Did this person know something that had not been printed? If the answer was no, the confession collapsed. But it still cost time. A false confession is not harmless. It sends detectives down another hallway. It gives newspapers something fresh. It forces police to spend hours proving a lie false while the true trail cools. In the Black Dahlia case, the press had already revealed enough to make lies easier. A man could sound informed simply by repeating what the city had been reading over breakfast. The same problem followed the letters. Paper has a false authority. You can hold it, open it, dust it, examine the folds, study the postmark, search for fingerprints, compare the language. In the Black Dahlia case, reported communications and packages became part of the investigation's atmosphere. One communication, described in accounts of the case, arrived with personal items said to belong to Elizabeth and a message assembled from clipped words. That changed the temperature of the room. Those personal items also changed the moral temperature of the investigation. A newspaper headline is public by nature. A handbag, an address book, a small piece of someone's ordinary life is different. It belongs to the world of errands and friends, phone numbers, meetings, and places a person expected to return to. When such items enter a murder file, they do more than suggest evidence. They remind investigators that the victim's life was not an abstraction. For the public, though, private objects can become another spectacle. A detail that should make the room quieter can instead make the headline louder. That tension sits all through the Black Dahlia case. The closer the file gets to Elizabeth as a person, the more the public version tries to turn that closeness into drama. Police needed the objects because they might lead somewhere. The city wanted them because they made the story feel intimate. Those are very different hungers. A crank can write a sentence. A drunk can confess. But personal items force colder questions. How did the sender get them? Were they truly hers? Had they passed through innocent hands? Did the package come from the killer, someone close to her, someone who found or stole the items, or someone who understood exactly how to make Los Angeles lean closer? For a moment, paper looked like a bridge. Investigators had to treat it that way. If there were fingerprints, they had to be checked. If the items were genuine, their path mattered. If the language seemed informed, police had to decide whether the writer had private knowledge or had only learned how to imitate the public story. A real message could have changed everything. A false one could bury the real work under another layer of performance. That is why the package and the later communications have to be handled with care. They are among the most compelling parts of the case. But compelling is not the same as conclusive. Personal items may bring the writer closer to Elizabeth, or they may reveal that her belongings moved through hands the police could not fully reconstruct. Clipped words may look theatrical because the sender was theatrical, or because the sender wanted to imitate the kind of villain the public expected. Fingerprints may seem promising until they fail to connect to a person who can carry the case. The communication did not exist in a vacuum. By then, the city knew enough about the crime to imitate parts of it. It knew the nickname. It knew Elizabeth's face. It knew the case was worth attention. That meant every piece of paper had to be read twice. Once as possible evidence, once as possible performance. This double reading is exhausting, but it is necessary. A real clue and a successful hoax may look similar for a while. The difference is what survives checking. Again, the case produced movement. Movement was not the same as progress. The medical question became another corridor. Because of the nature of the crime, investigators and later writers considered whether the killer had knowledge of anatomy, medicine, or butchery. That possibility gave many theories their force. It narrowed the imagination toward surgeons, medical students, trained hands, and men whose professions seemed to fit the scene. It was a reasonable question to ask. It was not a conclusion. This is where true crime often cheats. It finds one troubling detail and lets that detail choose the ending. A skilled act does not automatically name a surgeon. An unusual scene does not automatically prove a conspiracy. A frightening method does not automatically identify a profession. The medical angle remained important because it could not be ignored. It remained unresolved because it did not carry a name all the way to proof. The investigation room was not the elegant place later films would prefer. It was probably closer to a tired room full of paper, maps marked and remarked, names copied from one sheet to another, telephones interrupting interviews. Officers returning with less certainty than they had when they left. A suspect could look promising in the morning and less so by evening because an alibi held, a date broke, a witness softened, or a confession turned out to be only a newspaper echo. The case did not fail because no one looked. It failed because looking and proving are different acts. The FBI's help mattered, but it was not magic. In 1947, investigators did not have mobile phone records, modern surveillance networks, DNA databases, or instant digital links between agencies. They had fingerprint files, interviews, photographs, correspondence, paper records, and human memory. Those tools could be powerful. They also had limits, and famous cases put pressure on every limit at once. The limitations of the period did not excuse every failure, but they shaped the battlefield. Interviews had to be written down, typed, circulated, and compared by people with limited time. A lead outside Los Angeles required calls, letters, cooperation, and waiting. Fingerprints could help when there were usable prints and a record to compare them to. They could not rebuild a missing route through a city. There was also the problem of sequence. In a case under public pressure, investigators must move quickly, but speed can create its own weakness. A witness is interviewed before another statement arrives that would have changed the questions. A possible suspect is checked before the police fully understand the timeline. A reporter prints a detail before detectives know whether they wanted it kept private. None of these things alone destroys a case. Together, they make clean proof harder to find. This is the practical side of memory. It is not romantic. It is paperwork, timing, imperfect memory, and the pressure of a city that wants an answer before the file can earn one. The press widened that pressure. I remember the old newsroom smelled better than most faces. Hot paper, stale smoke, coffee gone bitter, ink on fingers, wet coats when rain came in. A major case changed the posture of a room. Editors stood differently. Reporters leaned closer. Someone wanted a photograph. Someone wanted a family contact. Someone wanted the next edition to strike harder than the last. No one said the room was excited by tragedy. That would have sounded ugly. We used better words. Deadline, public interest, the city's right to know. Sometimes those words were true. Sometimes they covered appetite. The Black Dahlia case gave newsrooms everything they knew how to mishandle. A young woman, Hollywood atmosphere, police pressure, anonymous claims, and a nickname made for the front page. The same publicity that could bring a witness forward could teach a liar what to say. The same article that preserved a fact could fix a rumor so firmly that later generations mistake it for evidence. The public version of the case became cleaner than the police file. The public version had a beautiful victim, a dark city, a hidden killer, and a mystery with no door. The police file had statements to compare, letters to evaluate, suspects to eliminate, uncertain sightings, unfinished timelines, and leads that died without drama. That difference matters. A case can become famous because it is unresolved, then become harder to understand because fame gives it too many shapes. The suspect material never belonged in one neat folder. It was a stack. Some men entered because of proximity. They had seen Elizabeth, traveled with her, housed her, claimed her, or were claimed by someone else. Those names were necessary to check. Proximity does not prove guilt, but it cannot be skipped. Others entered because of behavior, a strange statement, a prior offense, a connection to the neighborhood, a medical skill, a resemblance, a habit of lying. Any one of those details could make a name glow for a while under enough pressure. Then there were the confessors, many with no connection, except the desire to become part of the story. In the early weeks, that meant wasted hours. In later years, it meant an archive crowded with claims that sound dramatic until they are asked to carry evidence. The later theories are the most seductive because they arrive after the original mess has been cleaned into boxes. A theory written decades later can move faster than detectives ever could. It can skip the tired interviews, the bad addresses, the contradictory witnesses, the lab limits, the pressure from officials, and the noise from reporters. A later theory can choose its lighting. That does not make every later theory false. It makes every later theory dangerous. Some researchers have asked serious questions. Some found documents worth reading. Some challenged old myths. But others began with a name and built a tunnel toward it, ignoring every stone that did not fit. Leslie Dillon and George Hodel entered later public debate through different paths and with different claims around them. Each has been argued over. Neither turned the case into a legal conclusion. That is the line the story has to keep. Argued over is not proven. Suspicious is not convicted. Interesting is not enough. Some theories are careful, some grotesque, and some emotionally satisfying because they give the file a villain large enough for the myth. None of that matters if the evidence cannot carry them. The strongest suspect theories usually survive because they answer a real discomfort in the file. They are not invented from nothing. A suspicious background, a possible connection, a medical angle, a family accusation, a pattern of behavior, or a strange statement can be enough to keep a name alive. The danger begins when the theory starts selecting only the facts that flatter it. A careful theory should make the case harder before it makes it simpler. It should explain why other possibilities fail. It should survive the loss of its most dramatic detail. It should be able to stand without asking the listener to accept atmosphere as evidence. Most public theories do not work that hard. They tell a cleaner story than the file allows. The case tempts people because it seems to demand a hidden room. A doctor, a powerful man, a police cover-up, a Hollywood connection, a family secret. Los Angeles made the case look cinematic, so the public keeps expecting the solution to be cinematic too. Evidence does not care whether a story has atmosphere. A suspect is not proven because he fits the mood. The case produced heat from the beginning. Calls, letters, headlines, theories, pressure, and people convinced they knew what professionals had missed. Light was rarer. Light is the path a case can follow without collapsing. The Black Dahlia file had more heat than light almost from the start. That is why later official attention and public re-examination never became closure. Review can sound dramatic, but often it produces something more frustrating than scandal. There were names, criticized decisions, competing memories, and possible directions. The distance between suspicion and proof stayed open. There is another reason the case keeps returning. It offers just enough structure to make people believe the missing piece must still be nearby. A named victim, a known date, a famous city, a public discovery, a quick identification, a hole in the timeline, a man questioned early, letters, personal items, medical speculation, later suspects. All of those pieces sound like the beginning of a solvable puzzle. The problem is that a puzzle is designed to be completed. A murder file is not. It is made from whatever survived, fear, time, mistakes, weather, human memory, and institutional limits. That is why later review can be so unsatisfying. The farther one moves from 1947, the easier the file becomes to arrange, and the harder it becomes to test. A modern reader can place every known element on a table, but cannot re-interview the first witnesses as they were then. A modern theory can make a dead suspect look plausible, but cannot always recover the evidence needed to move from plausibility to proof. A researcher can find a pattern in documents, but a pattern is not a verdict. The case keeps inviting certainty, then punishing it. This is not an argument for giving up. Cold cases sometimes move because someone rechecks an old assumption, finds a record, connects agencies, or applies a tool the original investigators did not have. But hope is different from certainty. Hope keeps the file from being forgotten. Certainty, when it comes too early, can become another kind of false confession. The Black Dahlia case has had more than enough false endings. The old case changed shape after 1947. An active investigation becomes something else with time. Witnesses age, detectives retire, reporters die, buildings disappear, streets change, records survive unevenly. A hotel lobby that once held a possible memory becomes a renovated space, then a photograph, then a footnote. The city that made the case becomes a different city with the same appetite for the story. Over time, the investigation stopped feeling active and began to feel archival. Police reports, FBI notes, newspaper clippings, letters, and old witness statements remained, but the people behind them were aging, moving away, or dying. Every year made a false certainty easier to sell and a true correction harder to prove. The question remained simple. Who killed Elizabeth Short? Every decade brought someone ready to answer. Some answers were built with care, some with anger, some with obsession, and some with the feeling that a case this famous must have a solution equally famous. Maybe that assumption is wrong. Maybe the truth was not grand enough for the legend. Maybe the killer did not need to be brilliant, protected, or theatrical. Maybe he only needed the limits of 1947, a damaged timeline, public confusion, and enough luck to move through the city before anyone understood what had happened. That possibility bothers people because a large myth seems to demand a large villain. But unsolved cases do not always obey narrative balance. Sometimes the person responsible is smaller than the story built around him. Sometimes the failure is not one grand conspiracy, but 1,000 smaller limits: missed timing, weak technology, contaminated memory, false leads, press hunger, bad luck, and the fact that a case can lose its cleanest chances early. This is where the story should return to Elizabeth. Not because remembering her solves the case. It does not. But because the unsolved space has too often been filled with everything except her life. The absence of a convicted killer made room for the public to judge her, redesign her, romanticize her, and use her as a symbol for whatever version of Los Angeles it wanted to condemn. A homicide victim's life can be relevant without becoming an excuse for the crime. That distinction was often lost. Elizabeth was young. She was unsettled. She may have wanted admiration, stability, affection, work, or simply a place that felt less temporary. Most people want some version of those things. They became sinister only because the ending was sinister. A young man can drift through a city and be called restless. A young woman does the same, and the file begins sharpening adjectives. Careful language does not soften the crime. It makes the victim more real. It admits what is known, holds back what is not, and refuses to fill the blank with moral suspicion because a woman is no longer alive to answer. The case does not need Elizabeth to be perfect. It needs her to be human. That should not be difficult, but the nickname made it difficult. Near the end of the file, two names seemed to sit beside each other. Black Dahlia, Elizabeth Short. One was made by the public, one belonged to a person. The nickname is louder. It cuts through time with the confidence of a headline. It carries mystery, glamour, danger, and every dark decoration later generations hung on the case. Elizabeth Short is quieter, and a quieter name is harder to protect. There is no legal ending to give this story, no proven confession, no final suspect who can be named without argument, no piece of evidence that forces the file closed. What remains is a case full of paper and a blank where the killer's name should be. The tragedy of the Black Dahlia case is not only that it remained unsolved, it is that it became famous in a way that made solving it feel almost secondary to owning a version of it. Police wanted evidence, newspapers wanted a story. Later writers wanted an answer. Audiences wanted the feeling that the dark room finally had a light switch. Elizabeth Short was caught in all of those wants after her death. The best telling of the case cannot repair that. It can only refuse to repeat the worst habit, using the nickname as if it were the woman, using the theories as if they were proof, and using the violence as if shock were the same as understanding. The file does not give the satisfaction people keep asking from it. It gives a young woman's name, a January morning, a broken timeline, a city that talked too loudly, and an investigation that never found the legal sentence it needed. The old copy editor slides the clipping back into the folder. Los Angeles is no longer the city of 1947. The skyline has changed. The streets have changed. The newspapers have changed. Even the way people consume fear has changed. But the old story survives because it contains the one thing audiences keep reaching for: an ending. There is none, only the file, the name, the nickname, the distance between them, and a question that has outlived everyone who first opened the paper and thought the answer would come soon.